says we still have a few minutes. Hello, welcome to SPARC Chats. I'm Rachel Marks, the network coordinator for SPARC. I'm joining you today from what is currently referred to as Leeds and Granville County, but is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Mississauga, and Algonquin peoples. This area is covered under the Crawford Purchase of 1783. As an immigrant to Canada as a child, I am in awe of the beauty of this country and all that has been done by the traditional caretakers of the land to maintain the delicate balance of ecosystems on the land, in the water, and in the air. My hope is that we can learn from those who cared for the land before us so that we can continue that work with the honesty, love, and wisdom shown by the original peoples. Today, we have the privilege of joining you virtually and using technology that is steeped in colonial mindset and that continues to marginalize Indigenous communities around the province. The need for better access to internet and technology in our Indigenous communities is ongoing and something I invite you to take a moment to consider and try to assist in bringing about. Tonight, we are joined by Tiina Kukkonen. Tiina is a visual arts educator and PhD candidate in the Faculty of Education at Queen's University. Her doctoral research focuses on the role of intermediary organizations in supporting rural arts organization. In her work as a research associate and consultant, she has helped advocate for increased access to arts education for students in Canada and worldwide. Over the last few years, she's worked closely with the Canadian Network for Arts and Learning and the English Language Arts Network on various projects. And she is currently the Director of Provincial Liaison, Social Media, and Advocacy for the Canadian Society for Education Through Art. As an educator, Tiina has taught visual arts to learners of all ages in a variety of school and community-based settings. Working primarily in felted wool, her art practice draws inspiration from northern nature, craft, and design. Welcome, Tiina.
Thank you. That was quite the introduction.
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. I'm great. It's a lovely day here in Eastern Ontario. And I know we're close by, so I think it's probably lovely there too.
Yeah, the sun was kind of coming through my window. I had to cover it up a little bit so it wouldn't be right in my face.
Right on. So Tiina, before we get started and we dive into your research, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
I think you pretty much covered most of it there. But yes, I am a PhD candidate at Queen's. I've also been a high school arts teacher. I teach sometimes in the Faculty of Ed, some of their arts education and visual arts courses. And in the community here in Kingston, I've also led a bunch of community arts workshops, which I will be continuing to do, hopefully, once the pandemic has kind of leveled off a little bit. I'd like to get back to in-person. But yeah, I've just been an advocate for the arts for, pretty long time, quite a few years now. And that's really the focus of my research, is how to increase access to arts education for Canadians and worldwide, like you said.
That's awesome. Thank you. Sorry, I realized I forgot to make you co-host and we want you to show your presentation later. That's really great. Like you've really done quite a bit, and I'm really intrigued also by the worldwide aspect. So maybe we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
But I know you have a presentation for us. So
I do.
You start.
Yeah. So I'll just get that on my screen. And I guess that should show there now. Okay. Is it showing?
It is showing on my computer. I'm just like, yes, it's on Facebook now.
Perfect. So thank you so much for that intro again. So today I will be talking about my doctoral research, as you mentioned, which focuses on intermediary organizations that support rural and remote arts education. And I'll go into more detail about what that means throughout the presentation. So just an overview of what I'll talk about in this presentation. So why we should care about rural arts education, or why I'm focusing on rural arts education, intermediary organizations, who they are and what they do, the types of organizations that exist to support rural arts education in Ontario and Quebec, because that was part of my research. I'll talk a little bit about the multi-case study that I did on these organizations and the findings of that, and finally some implications for rural arts education. So why focus on rural arts education? I mean, I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here because this is a rural arts network. But just in general, so access to diverse and high quality arts education in general is not consistent across Canada, particularly in the realm of school-based arts education. This situation is sometimes made worse in rural and remote communities that experience additional barriers in accessing arts education resources, such as the costs and distance involved with going on field trips to arts museums and things like that, ordering arts materials to communities and schools, or the costs and distance involved in teacher professional development. As it stands, rural arts education is also not talked about very much in educational research or discourse in Canada, despite many advocacy efforts over the last decade or so that have supported the potential of the arts to transform and sustain rural communities in economic, social, and cultural ways. So in my view, and in the view of many others who are working in this field, it's time we start paying more attention to rural arts education and also see what's happening and how we can support it at local and broad levels. So conceptualizing this idea of rural arts education has been really challenging for me in my research. Basically, as we know, there's no single definition of what rural means, particularly in Canada, which is a huge place. Coast to coast, there are a lot of different ways that we can think of rural. So it can be both a social and geographic concept, depending on how you want to look at it. So in light of this, I've actually made an effort to kind of collect perspectives from different people through conferences, workshops, social media, just to see how different people conceptualize rural. And one question that came up through my research was the idea of rural according to who? Who decides what's rural and what's not rural? And also distinctions that communities make between rural, remote, northern, Indigenous, all these different ways that we talk about rural within the Canadian context. All this to say, I left the definition pretty open in my research, and I personally see it as a very fluid concept that I'm constantly learning about through my discussions with different people. Similarly, arts education is also a very difficult thing to define because it can also mean a lot of things, but in general, I view it as learning in, through, and about the arts in all of its forms, whether that's visual arts, music, craft, digital arts, dance, drama, etc., in both school and out of school learning environments. And I think it's important to expand our Western and urban notions of what constitutes art and arts education when working within rural contexts because of the diverse ways that art is conceptualized across rural and Indigenous cultures in this province and across Canada. So this is just a little image that shows some of the Post-it notes that I've collected from people that kind of conceptualize different ways of looking at rural. So this is what I do usually in workshops. I'll give Post-its and I'll ask people just to write a simple word or draw a picture that for them represents rural. And I find it's been a really interesting way to gather different views. So my research, as we've mentioned a couple of times now, focuses on organizations that exist to support rural arts education, specifically those that act as intermediaries between different partners. So partnerships, as many of us know, are key to the growth of any rural sector, including arts education. So intermediaries are found across many different disciplines and are commonly understood as the middle people that exist between two or more parties, usually with the aim of catalyzing some kind of positive change within and among those partners. There are different types of IOs, which I'll describe in a minute. And IOs, I mean intermediary organization. I often shorten it that way, but so when I say IO, I mean intermediary organization. But in general, they can and do play a very important role in supporting rural arts education because of their capacity to take on these different functions that I've listed here. So assembling key stakeholders, brokering partnerships and supporting those partnerships, advancing policy and advocacy work, and also mobilizing resources. So the first step in my research was to investigate what types of intermediary organizations exist with the potential to support rural arts education. I conducted an environmental scan through Google, limiting my research to the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, mostly for sanity's sake, just because, again, Canada is so big, and also because that's where I'm located and that's the realm that I've worked within, Ontario and Quebec. So through the scan, I identified 83 different organizations that fit within 5 major organizational types, and 2, as you can see here, with their own set of subtypes. So I won't go into too much detail about each of these different types, but just in general, we have membership networks. So these are networks for arts, education, and rural professionals and stakeholders. They typically offer professional tools and resources, advocacy support, and opportunities for networking and exchange. So 2 subtypes for those include discipline-specific, which would mean visual arts or music, and interdisciplinary and cross-sector membership networks. Funders and foundations, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So these are public and private entities that offer grants, awards, services, and programs to support the development in realms of arts and culture, education, economic prosperity, and community well-being. Research and knowledge mobilization entities. So these are organizations, exchange forums, think tanks devoted to researching, mobilizing, and disseminating information to the public, with the aim of educating, encouraging dialogue, and or informing policy. Mentorship and capacity building organizations provide professional coaching, mentoring, and capacity building services for individuals and communities. And finally, arts engagement outreach organizations that serve rural communities through arts outreach initiatives that include performances, festivals, educational programming, and professional development. So with that, there were 4 different subtypes: performing arts outreach, institutional outreach, regional arts outreach, and artist in residence outreach. It's a mouthful. So this is a framework that I developed to look at these organizations and what they do. So using this framework of functions, I analyzed the 5 organizational types. So each type has its own certain intermediary strengths. So for instance, membership networks. So SPARC would be an example of a membership network, as well as CODE, Canadian Network for Arts and Learning, etc. So they are really great. They're very strong in assembling key stakeholders. So like through symposia, through conferences, networking events, things like that. So that's what they're really strong in. Research and knowledge mobilization organizations are really strong in policy and advocacy efforts because they're constantly putting out reports, things like that support those kinds of efforts. Funders and foundations, of course, mobilize resources. We know that. Whereas arts engagement outreach organizations are typically more involved on the ground in communities, brokering and supporting partnerships at the local level. So here, again, I've listed a bunch of examples that you can see of different organizations in Ontario that would fit under each of those categories. So one thing that I found from searching these organizations is that many of them do not use the term rural specifically to describe their mandates and activities. So that means if you're searching for a specific type of service or grant for a rural initiative, you might have to spend some time considering how to frame your proposal or initiative in such a way that it fits in what these organizations have to offer. So for instance, many organizations are focused on reaching underserved populations. So then you might have to look at it that way or frame your project that way. I found that artist in residence outreach organizations that partner artists with communities and schools commonly performed all of these functions, which led me to examining these types of organizations more in depth to see how they operate. So I did a 5 multi-case study of organizations that offer artist in residence outreach in Ontario and Quebec. So I looked at how do these IOs operate to support rural arts education partnerships and what benefits are experienced by the different parties involved as a result of those partnerships. So I interviewed organization team members and also outside individuals that were involved with their work. So those included artists, community, and partnering organizations. So this is just a broad overview of the cases. So I had 5 different ones. They all differed in how many years they were in operation, the regions they served, as well as the mandates, again, which were not rural focused, but you have here like an Indigenous focused organization, one that was looking at supporting minority language speaking artists in Quebec. And so you can see the differences across. And what did I find? So in general, to answer the question of how they operate to support rural arts education partnerships, I found that they did perform all of these functions that I outlined in this framework, plus the additional function of encouraging sustainability and autonomy within the communities to support their capacity to carry out that type of work. So I'll just go through quickly some of the best practices that were articulated through the interviews as they pertain to the different functions in the framework. So for assembling key stakeholders, I found that these organizations identified partners by drawing on existing networks, contacts, programs, attending conferences, hosting showcases, applying for grants, and sending representatives to meet with locals. Because one thing I didn't mention is that all of these organizations are situated in major cities with outreach into rural communities. So that was part of their assembling key stakeholders, was that they needed to actually send people into the rural communities to be able to liaise with the people there and get them on board for their initiatives. Recruiting diverse partners and sponsors. So that was in terms of in-kind resources, expertise, public sector, corporate sector partners, and foundations. They often did public calls and targeted outreach to rural communities and selecting those artists that they sent to the communities based on the needs of the communities and the schools themselves. And particularly within rural contexts, they often looked at building rural tours to be able to encourage buy-in from the different schools in the rural communities, because when you think about sending an artist from an urban area into a rural community, what's going to be the most worthwhile? Well, if you're sending them to multiple schools or bringing multiple schools to one location, that will help with the buy-in. Some obstacles that they said were hindering their work. Time is always a big one. So schedule restrictions, commitment from the commitment needed from partners to carry out those initiatives, and building relationships and trust with rural communities. Transportation to and from activities when they're doing them in rural communities, that's always an issue. And then implementing change. So if they're coming into a new rural place and they're offering this great arts education initiative, but it's really hindering, the way the school or the community functions, that could be an obstacle to face in the implementation of those partnerships and the arts education initiative. So incentives and strategies that they use. Organization and efficiency was a big one. Previous positive experience on the part of the school and community. If they've had great experiences with the arts in the past, they'd be more willing to enter into it. Relevant project themes and targeted programs for those specific communities. Sourcing local artists, of course. Fostering community ownership over projects. Ascertaining the readiness of people to enter into partnerships. Leveraging community venues and reframing the rationale from buy-in. So emphasizing how each person group will benefit from the project is one way to do that. So they also supported by guiding vision, strategy, and communication across the initiative and with many partners. So this meant a lot of time just bringing people around, whether it was around an actual table or virtual space, just to constantly check in with them to make sure that everything was going well and to troubleshoot any issues that were coming up. And also fostering community engagement with whatever the arts initiative is that they were doing. So that was done through radio, blogs, websites, social media, and organizing culminating celebrations and festivals alongside the artists and the school partners. Promoting quality and accountability for that was for those partnerships was another big one that they did. And they did this through using many strategies. Vetting artists and organizational partners before sending them into communities was obviously a big promoter of quality, and mandatory training for artists, teachers, and mentors before they enter into partnerships. Communicating, again, that impact data and gathering the impact data, and just making sure that whatever impacts they were having, they were communicating that to the partners. And also just creating action lists was a big one, because you can talk to people during, after projects, but if you're not actually listening to what the partners are saying and implementing the changes that they're recommending, then the sustainability could be at risk in the future. And one organization actually made an effort to create space for mental health and well-being, and that was for their artists and their teachers, which I thought was really interesting. So that included mental health and peer supports, and also paid time and space to check in, to plan, and for personal art making. So advancing policy and advocacy work was another thing that they did really well. And they said that having people dedicated to that, such as the executive director, was really beneficial. And appointing team members to stay on top of policy changes in the bigger picture, increasing broad awareness among funders and policymakers of what factors enable arts education and arts education partnerships, and valuing and advocating for youth agency, because eventually they will run the show one day. And mobilizing resources. They did this in a number of different ways. So connecting with lots of different funders, like I mentioned before, being open to what schools can contribute, especially in the rural context. You know, you might go into this partnership saying, well, schools have to match this amount of funding, they have to do this, they have to do this. So really being open to what those schools have and what they can offer. And it might not be money per se, but maybe they have something else that they could offer instead of that. Developing programs that can run on minimal resources also helps. And creating resource databases for artists and teachers, such as study guides and curriculum summaries, to help them with their partnerships. Finally, encouraging sustainability and autonomy. So they did this by learning from and partnering with other organizations that are involved in this work, creating opportunities for cross-sector exchange. Building partner capacity was really the big one. Many of them talked about that they really want the communities themselves to be able to take ownership of this work and to be able to carry it on in the future. So building that capacity involved professional development for artists and teachers, coaching and mentoring for community partners, and keeping the lines of communication open before, during, and also after projects if community partners, for instance, have any questions moving forward as to how they could continue this. And I won't go into so many, I know I'm going into like all these different strategies, but they're all there. And so this is an example of what I did when I was analyzing this research data. I decided to make a board game of my research. And I thought that this would be a great way to kind of communicate my research findings in a different way, and also encourage the organizations that took part in the study and anyone else out of the research world to engage with my research findings and reflect on their practices. So I'm currently in the process of finalizing this. I just wanted to show an image of it, and it will be shared with the organizations, like I said, that participated in my study, and I will have it available basically to anybody who is interested in looking at that closer. So it's a whole thing. I included like the obstacles, the strategies, and the resources. So I have a whole way of playing it, and hopefully it'll be an interesting way for people to engage with it later on. So the second question, just what are the benefits of these types of partnerships and initiatives? So from the perspective of different stakeholders involved. So for artists, professional development, building confidence, connecting with new schools and audiences, experiencing new places and cultures, additional income and job prospects, and developing a community of artists were the things that they were saying in the interviews. For teachers, they articulated changed perceptions of their students to see them in a more positive light in their abilities, new teaching approaches that they gained primarily from the artists, understanding the value of arts integration in schools, developing a willingness to take risks and be creative in their own teaching practice, and developing their own artist identities. Schools benefited by creating a positive atmosphere in the school, beautifying their space, fostering student connections to school, attaining academic goals, and increasing student attendance and retention. Students became more expressive, motivated, confident, and focused. They had exposure to new experiences and art forms that they might not have experienced otherwise, increased community engagement through the projects, developing new technical skills, but as well as personal and emotional skills as well, developing a sense of belonging, reaffirming culture and identity, and of course, joy. We forget joy when we talk about the benefits of art, just that joy that comes from creating a piece of art with others. Communities, the rural communities benefited by promoting local tourism and economic development, access to new artists and art experiences, developing the local arts and culture scene, community visibility through local and regional media, developing community pride, and preventing youth crime even in some instances because the youth were busy making art. And finally, organization and industry partners benefited by meeting their own organizational goals, reaching their target audiences, access to shared resources, identifying new approaches to collaboration, having a sense of contribution to the communities, and developing capable future employees and consumers for whatever their industries were. So what does that mean in total for rural arts education? So here I offer some implications to consider. So first, for rural communities and schools, IOs can help bring together the many different kinds of partners that are needed for project success and provide much needed structure in terms of funding and guidance. That said, the usefulness of IOs depends on the type of artists, the type of arts project and initiative. So for example, IOs would be likely more helpful in facilitating partnerships where artists and teachers plan and deliver programming together, as opposed to cases where artists are just giving performances in schools. Rural schools and communities also have to be ready to receive and support projects on their end. Otherwise, projects are not likely to succeed. So the IOs that I interviewed for this study mentioned the importance of not only going to places where they have been expressly invited and where they can see a willingness, but also where they can see a willingness to enter into reciprocal partnerships. So they will not go where they're not wanted, is basically the message they said. To encourage local buy-in, identifying and having a SPARC person in the community really helps. Sustainability of artist partnerships beyond what the IO can offer relies on capacity building, like I said, at the local level, which means involving as many local entities and partners as possible from the get-go. Something that is challenging for IOs and partners, but it's also really important, is the establishment of robust and consistent processes for communication and evaluation, which promote investment and accountability on all ends of the partnership. And finally, advocacy for rural artists and residents programs and partnerships needs to happen at local, organizational, governmental levels to ensure their continued existence and success. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, like I said, it's a lot, so it's good that it'll be recorded and people can kind of refer back to it.
Yeah, definitely. I have a quick question on that, which it's not on, sorry. My quick question is, can we get access to the slides afterwards for people that might be interested?
Of course. And like my contact info is there as well. So if anybody has any questions, they can always email me. That's fine.
Amazing. That was fantastic, that presentation. Before we get to our Q&A, I do want to say I love the SPARC person in the community. Because yay, we're SPARC.
Yes.
But also we totally involve community animators as part of our membership, and that knowledge that often there's one or two people in a community that really sort of galvanize and bring stuff to the community. So how important is that person, do you think?
Oh, well, I mean, again, through my research, like that was said time and time again, that you need to have that SPARC person. All of these projects, these partnerships, they're only initiated usually because there's somebody in the community who already has an interest. Like these organizations will not go to a community where they're not invited, because then they're just kind of imposing their programs on people that may not be ready for it and don't necessarily want them there. So, but if you have somebody in the community, then they're there and they can talk to people on the ground, kind of get them excited about the project, maybe get people around and see like what different community assets there might be to contribute to the project and that sort of thing. So it's definitely vital to have that.
That's awesome. We have a question from Facebook that I actually wrote down too. And it's, what a great idea to turn your research into a game. Where can we find access to that?
That's a good question. So for right now, like I'm still working on it. So my doctoral defense will actually be this summer. So it's still under review. So the game is part of that. So the game is still kind of under review. So the final version is not there. But as I said, I have my email on these slides. So if anybody has an interest in that game, I can take your name down and kind of contact you later on when it's actually ready, which should be towards the end of July.
I think it's a fantastic idea. Like it's completely out of the box. And I was like, wow, I could probably learn a lot playing that game. And I thought a lot of our communities, it's a great way to sort of warm up to the idea of who does what and how it happens.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
that was the idea behind it.
So we have a second question here. How do the various IOs promote their programs in the community so the community animator or SPARC person knows about what they do?
So that's done in different ways. Usually, like I said, like they have targeted outreach for a lot of rural communities, and particularly like the ones I looked at, they're working with schools, right? So it's a little bit easier for them because they can contact the school board who might have a person to kind of disseminate that information into the actual schools on the ground. If it's more community based, it is a challenge. So like a lot of the organizations were talking about how like they would love to have more connections with rural artists and local artists in those places, but they're very hard to find, right? If you don't have somebody that's connected within that community, then it's very difficult. So they often draw on their network of contacts because, again, like a lot of people within these organizations, that's what they do. Like they're constantly networking and contacting people to see where their services could be most useful. So that's primarily how they're doing it right now. Just that targeted outreach and just networking, word of mouth, getting it out there is the main way.
Yeah, it can be hard, right? Like going into communities if you don't know anyone there. And that actually sort of led me to one of the questions from your slides when you talked about finding local artists. And you said just it could be hard. My question is like with a lot of these IOs, what do you find? Did you look into the percentage of local artists doing programming versus touring artists? Like I'm just interested to see what that might be.
Yeah, no, that wasn't specifically part of what I was looking at, but that is an interesting thing to look at in the future is like how many of their artists are actually local. From my understanding, most of them are not. So they have their artist rosters. So some of them, like, their artist rosters are province wide, right? Like they're all over the place. Sometimes they're just located within those cities where they're operating, and then they're sending them out to the rural communities, which can be very expensive, as we can imagine. So that's part of the reason why they're so interested. Like, we really want more rural and local artists, indigenous artists. Like, please, if you're local, get in contact with us, sort of thing. And it's important for the sustainability too, and for that community connection.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to go back to some other questions that we received ahead of time. What led you to research rural arts education?
So that's many different experiences in my life have led to this PhD. So personally, like I grew up in a small town that was very rich in the arts. So they have like a village theater, studio tour, like the works. But it was very adult focused. So as a youth myself, I found that access to diverse art education opportunities was somewhat limited. And like I had to kind of look elsewhere, closer to the bigger city to be able to find that. So that was one reason. I also did an exchange in northern Finland during my undergrad in the Arctic. So, and that I was really inspired there by their different community-based arts education projects that they were doing, initiated by the university, but that took place in northern remote communities. So I was fascinated by that. Work-wise, I worked in northern Quebec through an IO, through an intermediary organization. So that really kind of kicked me into this gear. So I was an art specialist that worked with high school kids to develop visual arts and media programming. So that experience really inspired me to look at more organizations that are supporting arts education in rural, remote places. And then finally, like my work also through like Canadian Network for Arts and Learning, I was interviewing arts stakeholders across the province of Ontario as part of my job. And consistently, again, it came up that like we need more support for rural arts education, and we need more people to start talking about this because it's usually very urban focused.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I often wonder why that is, so why it is so urban focused when we have this wealth of rural and remote artists working in communities. Like I wonder if sometimes, like you said, making that connection, right? Like, yeah, very interesting. Okay, next question. What is the most interesting thing that you have discovered during your research? That's a good one.
It is a good one. It's also, there's a few things. Like it's hard to pin down just one thing. I touched on this a little bit in the presentation, but I found it really interesting how challenging it was to find organizations that offer arts education services to rural populations. The most obvious ones, like I said, were located in major cities with outreach to rural places. However, like I'm very aware, as you're very aware, that rural places are very rich in arts and culture. And there are many, many artists that are working in rural and remote places. But they're not easily found through internet searches, which is part of what I was doing as part of my research, right? So as I mentioned, how people define their work also influences their searchability. So very few actually use the word rural, to define what they're doing, which makes them difficult to search on the internet. Another interesting thing I think was the difference in the number of organizations that I found in Ontario versus Quebec. So Ontario in general seemed to have a lot more going on than Quebec. And even though I did my search in English and French, but I feel like perhaps moving forward, if it was a French speaking researcher who was doing this, they might have more success in finding more of these organizations across Quebec, just because it is a predominantly French speaking province. But I can say that Ontario has a lot of great stuff happening, and a lot of organizations and programs that exist to support rural arts initiatives and rural initiatives in general. And finally, I think the last thing that I found kind of really intriguing was the fact that these organizations really didn't have a sense of ownership over their programs and their projects. And what I mean by that is that, all of them kind of articulated, like, we hope to work ourselves out of a job, like we don't want to be doing this forever. Like if somebody else comes along that can do it better, great. But really the point is that they want people at the local level in these communities to be able to carry on this work on their own. So that's where that capacity building, again, was really a major focus of many of these organizations, just being like, we want to help you to learn, how do you initiate a partnership with an artist? Like, how do you find funding? How do you write a grant? How do you keep those lines of communication open between the artist and the different partners that are going? Because, it's not sustainable in a sense to have these outside organizations constantly coming in and doing this work. Especially with the barriers, like I talked about, that they're not always welcome, so it's great that if capacity could exist at the local level to do that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think especially now, right, during COVID, like there's a whole other layer of barrier brought on,
Yeah.
like a whole other layer of people coming into a smaller rural community that, like, well, we know no one's touring, right? So, but yeah, very interesting. I want to flip. I had a question from your slides. I'm really intrigued by the wellness, the group that did the wellness and the check-ins. And did they talk about, or did you feel that had a big impact on the artists and then hence the projects?
Yeah, so that organization in particular, like I was amazed at how much like they really considered everybody, everybody's needs that were involved in the partnership. And I think in general, like I didn't have much of an opportunity to talk to the actual artists and teachers in that case to see what impact that had. But my sense was that like it was just more about just valuing them like as professionals and as people, right? Like when you're paying people, like this is the time that we want to check in with you. It's part of your work day. So we're going to pay you for that time. Or we're going to pay you as part of this program to be able to, explore your art form a little bit more. Or if you're in the case of the teacher, to be able to explore themselves as artists a little bit more. So then again, that sustainability piece, like if teachers are doing that, they might be more comfortable later on to continue that on their own, even if an artist isn't involved in the project, and they can just do that by themselves in the classroom. So I found that like really respectful of people's time and of who they are. And especially if you're bringing an artist into a remote context of any kind, and they're not used to that, having that mental health support in place was really valuable, because you need somebody to talk to sometimes, just to be like, this is very foreign to me. Like, I'm not used to living in this way, or like the culture is very different. The language might be very different. So, and talking to somebody that's not your employer as well, so they had a separate mental health support, like a professional in place that their artists could talk to. And I thought that was really great and really interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it also sounds very empowering as well, right?
Yeah.
Like for everybody involved, especially like how you mentioned about the teachers and allowing them to continue to find or to voice the artist within themselves, which they may
Yeah.
not have an opportunity to do usually.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, so we have another question, and that is, what piece of advice would you give to people who want to bring arts education experiences into their communities? That's pretty heavy.
Yeah. I would say, just to, like, if there's one thing I learned from this research, is just to think outside the box as much as possible in terms of potential partnerships, funding opportunities, and arts programs. So for example, there tends to be quite a bit of money for mental health and for health initiatives, right? So as a SPARC person in the community, or as a teacher, an arts teacher in the community, what have you, you might design an arts project that has, that promotes mental health, or that promotes health in some way. And then you might partner even with like a local health organization or a health board to bring them on the project to help write the grant. And then, it's just about framing it in such a way that you're appealing to these different funders that have all this money to give, right? But they might not say that it's for an arts project, or that it's for a rural project in particularly. So you just kind of have to like think outside the box in terms of those different types of partnerships and initiatives that you can make around the arts, that include the arts, but might not be, just for the arts, because that can be very difficult to find, as we know, in terms of funding.
Yeah, and that actually sort of dovetails onto it, or leads me to a question that I had during your presentation, which was, can IOs help communities or schools find funding so they can access their programs?
Yeah, so definitely. So, so the IOs are oftentimes, like, they are not the ones that I interviewed, for instance, they're not the funder. So part of their job is that they find funding. Like, they're constantly looking for funding for these types of initiatives that they can then offer to schools. So schools will have to submit a proposal and say, like, and kind of usually they have to articulate some kind of need. Like, they have to show that they are in need of this type of money. And then they'll be asked to kind of match the funding in some way. So as I said, like, these IOs typically are open to what that can look like. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like, we're giving you $3,000, we want you to give $3,000. It could be, we're giving you this amount of money. What can you give that's an equivalent of that in terms of resources, in terms of, community expertise, anything like that. So there's different ways that happens. And it's not always like the onus of the communities to come up with some kind of funding to be able to run the partnership. Usually the IO is involved in that pretty heavily. And if they're not providing that funding, then I imagine that they can help to find the funding. Like, they'd be able to know where that funding exists.
Yeah, that's great, because I think that's knowing that for a lot of our members who may not have known that, it's like, oh, well, now I have someone that I could go to, and maybe we don't have this money, but we have this in kind, or we have, or they can help us. So that's awesome.
Exactly.
Thank you. Okay. I have so many questions of my own written down, but I'm going to go back to the other ones. So, as an artist yourself, do you feel that rural communities provide ample opportunities for arts education? And what can be done to change or improve that if needed?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. We touched on this already, because we know that, like, rural communities are like, they have lots of arts and culture. I think it's wrong to assume from the part of anybody, including these organizations, to assume that rural communities are lacking, right? Because that's kind of how a lot of the research is framed, is that, the reason we're doing this work is because they lack the resources, or they lack this and they lack that. And I think that's not always the right approach to take. Just because it's not written in a journal article or it's not stated on a website doesn't mean it's not there. But like I said, it is a known fact that arts education opportunities differ from place to place, especially in schools, because of different budgets and access to qualified arts educators and all these other types of things that come into play. So, and I think it also depends on what types of supports are put in place to sustain arts and culture within those communities. So an example that comes to mind is like I was traveling once around Nova Scotia, and I was in this small little town on the ocean that's really well known for rug hooking. And they had a great little collective of rug hookers there. They had a nice little shop, but the collective was made up of women mostly that were 75 years of age and older. And talking with them, one of the things they said was like, well, you know, we don't really have any young people anymore that are interested in taking on this art form and continuing this tradition that had been going on for like over, 100, 200 years in this small community. And, and that got me thinking about this too, like the importance of really engaging young people in the arts as much as possible and in any way possible from a very young age. And one of the examples that comes to mind that I'm sure you've heard too is like integrating the arts into sports events, for instance, is a great strategy to do that because, often like in a lot of northern communities, I know like hockey is huge and they'll travel between communities to play hockey. So why not like throw in some arts into the halftime or before or after the events to really encourage community engagement and to get the youth involved as much as possible.
Yeah, I love that idea too, because I feel like it's taking art out of these perceived places where it belongs, and it's showing people that it's an everyday part of life, that it should be accessible to everyone.
Yeah, the everyday part is really key as well. And I'm glad you mentioned that because that is something that came up in the research too, was this idea of promoting a culture of arts integration in communities. And that is exactly that idea that like the arts are part of everyday life, and just accepting, and everyone in the community. So like in this case, like teachers and schools, just understanding the value of integrating the arts into the curriculum, for communities to understand the value of integrating the arts in the community as a way to promote like not only cultural sustainability, but like economic prosperity as well, and environmental prosperity and sustainability, right? So there's so many different ways that it helps, and creating that culture of arts is part of that. And I'm sure people have heard the term like rural arts ecosystem is one that's kind of thrown around a lot. So it's the same idea.
Yeah, I'm just going to throw this out to everyone on Facebook, and I do keep looking down because I'm looking at the chat box. If you have any questions, please let us know. We only have a few minutes left with Tiina, but I wanted to sort of backtrack a little like to what you're saying. It wasn't so long ago, this stats were coming out that rural arts was the fastest growing tourism and industry in the province, right? And from what you're saying, like this whole rural arts ecosystem and arts education can really impact that and create that sustainability. Is that
yeah
because
usually when you talk about like the rural arts ecosystem, at least from what I've read, like it is talked about quite a bit, but like for some reason that arts education piece is always left out of that, right? Like it's always approached from an economic perspective, like we need to create partnerships among these different businesses and sectors and things like that. But I think that arts education piece is very clearly like an important part of that needs to be talked about.
Yeah, it really is the center of our community, right? And our storytelling and our history as a community. Okay, we have another question here. So this is sort of the opposite of one of our previous questions, and it is, what piece of advice would you give to rural arts educators who want to expand their reach or practice?
I guess that would depend on like what you're defining as an arts educator, right? Because that an arts educator could be somebody in a school, or it could be like a teaching artist, for instance, as many of your members I'm sure are teaching artists. So like I guess I could talk first from a teaching artist perspective. I mean, getting on an artist roster with one of these organizations is pretty key, particularly if you're interested in getting into schools, because schools are not usually very keen on accepting like cold calls from artists, like being like, I'd love to work in a classroom. They're not usually down for that. That's why these organizations exist, because they have that reputation and they vet the artist beforehand. So really getting on one of those lists is probably one of the best ways to kind of expand your reach if you're interested in that. And like I said, like these organizations, they want more rural and local and indigenous artists on board. So if you do a search and you find some of these organizations, just like contact them and say like, I'm interested in becoming an artist on your roster, and like, what is the process for that? Because they do have different vetting processes that you would need to go through. Also for the part of schools, it's really helpful as in teaching artists to kind of familiarize yourself with the curriculum. Like all of the Ontario curriculum documents are available online, like through the Ministry of Education website. And schools and teachers really appreciate that. Like when an artist kind of goes the extra mile and says like, this is how my proposed arts project or performance or what have you fits into the curriculum. And if you just state like a few of those points, like, wow, okay, great. You know, they can really see the connection with the curriculum, and then they'll be more willing to come on board. I think other than that, like joining as many, you know, the membership networks that I talked about, SPARC, of course, is a membership network. So joining those professional membership networks are a really great way, of course, as we already know, for networking. That assembling stakeholders piece that they do is really, really important. So whatever your discipline is, finding those networks that really resonate with that and that relate to that will help you to connect with different stakeholders across the country and also within your region. I know that the Canadian Network for Arts and Learning, again, I used to work with them. They've developed an online map of arts and learning, and anybody who's involved in arts and arts education can get on that map. And I know that it's being used more widely now. I was there at the base level of it, like when it was just being developed, and then people are like, what is this? But now like they've got thousands of people on there, and it's a really great resource. And I think people are starting to use it more. And other than that, I think as you probably already know too, local arts councils are an invaluable resource. Many of them also have artist in residence programs. So whether you are a teacher, whether you are an artist, you can look to a local arts council for professional development opportunities for those types of programs. They'll usually post funding opportunities. So anything like that. And they would know the local area better than anybody, right? And would be able to help that way. And yeah.
Those are some great tips.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I really think too that the one about like saying how your work matches up to the curriculum in order to get into the schools is very important. And of course, I'm going to say joining your member network is also very important because you can connect with other people doing the same thing as you. I mean, it's always great to be able to talk to your peers, especially because in our practice, often depending on what size community we're from or what type of community, the culture in that community, we can be siloing and not really understand or know other artists. So
yeah, and I have to say, like I told you that I attended the SPARC symposium a couple years back in Cobalt, and it was one of like my favorite. Like I go to a lot of conferences and things like that, and that was one of my most favorite conferences, just because I mean the energy, like it was just amazing. Like we were actually in a rural place, like a remote place, and you know, just learning about that place in itself. Like it was just, you were there and you're feeling the local culture from like everything that we ate, and the food, like the food we ate, like everything was just so local. It was amazing. And just meeting people from across the province that are working in this area. Like, where do you get that type of opportunity, and where do you feel that type of energy otherwise? Like, it's through these networks. Like, that's how it's done, and that's where you learn the most.
Well, thank you for saying that, and I think we should clip that and make it into a, you know, join SPARC. Here's what Tiina has to say, because it was
Please
great.
do. Advice from Tiina: join SPARC. Go to the next symposium.
Yes, please do. So we just have a few minutes left. I'm just going to do another shout out. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat box. But I want to say something that I just love that you added was joy. The students experience joy in the projects. Like,
Yeah.
That's so
I mean,
important.
and that's everybody. That it's not just the students. It's like the artists, the teachers, the community themselves. Like the stories that I heard, like I don't have time to go into all of them now, but they were so inspiring to really hear how like the arts extended into the communities where like parents were getting involved and like writing poetry on their own from a poetry artist, like a poet that came in, and it just like continuing on and just being inspired and feeling like the joy that comes from art making and from making art with other people. And I think the performing arts, like that's where it happens most often, is when you're performing with other people, right? And there's so much joy that comes from that. And I think that no matter what, we can't forget that, because we focus so much on like academic skills and like what else can we get from like the economic prosperity or whatever else comes from these partnerships. But just like remember the value of having a good time with other people and feeling that connection with other people.
That's getting a lot of hearts on our Facebook screen right now, and I'm going to give it one too, because I agree. And I think that that is perhaps the best way to end our presentation and interview with Tiina. So I'm going to try and figure out how to stop this. This is only my second Zoom to Facebook Live. And also sorry for my tongue-tiedness earlier. I just had so many thoughts from your work. It's incredible. And thank you so much for joining us this evening.
My pleasure. And I know it was a lot of information. So again, I will reiterate that like if anyone has any questions whatsoever, please like feel free to share my email on whatever page you want. And I'm happy to continue the conversation further with anyone who wants to.
That's amazing. Thank you. We've had a couple people here say they definitely want to get the game. So
Yes.
I know they will be looking. And we have a comment that says, "Thank you, Tiina. That was interesting and very well done." And that is
Thank
from one of
you.
our Northern Cobalt folks.
Nice. Yes. Visit Cobalt. Visit Cobalt. Yes. And to Temiskaming
Okay.
Shores.
Let's, oh, and there's another, "Thank you for all your work. Great presentation." So I just want to make sure you got those comments, and we all agree. And now I'm going to stop the live stream and say good night to everybody. Thank you so much.